The next question from Sprackspiel. I'm interested to what extent you think dysgenic breeding over the last 150 years is real and has been a source of serious problems. How much has the slowdown in scientific progress or cultural decline been a result of dysgenics? So I think it's definitely real in that there have been a couple of studies that have documented uh, over time decline in average polygenic scores. There was one study in Iceland which
Hmm.
used a very comprehensive database and showed that the average polygenic score for education has declined in Iceland over several decades, almost certainly due to uh, dysgenic breeding, i.e., fertility being negatively correlated with the polygenic score in question. Because Iceland, over the relevant period, had had very little immigration, so the data was not confounded by um, that factor. I personally don't think it's really had any noticeable impact, dysgenics, on Western populations so far. It may have had a very minor one, but it's almost impossible to detect, uh, given all the other important things going on, such as immigration and cultural trends and technological trends. What's your sense?
That's exactly what I would say. So there was, of course, the demographic transition where the correlation between status and children reversed, so that lower status people were having more children, which you would expect to lead to some kind of small dysgenic trend. But I don't think uh, it's a mere like splotch of paint on an enormous canvas of other variables that are important. As to the scientific slowdown, if there is one, and we'd have to operationalize that, and that gets difficult. I think principle of low-hanging fruit probably accounts for most of that. That is to say,
Yeah.
the big discoveries have been made because they're easier to make in some sense. And the ones that we're still wrestling with are much more difficult or they're smaller, like more technical puzzles. As the cultural decline, as a pessimist, as a morose person, I am open to the claim that there's been a cultural decline. Certainly, when I look at the novel, for example, there's not a lot to celebrate. I'm not a huge fan of Thomas Pynchon or Don DeLillo, for example. Nevertheless, I'm often skeptical of those kinds of claims, which you can find in every generation. And um, we'd have to operationalize culture and then figure out how to measure the quality of the culture. And one thing to think about is that there's a survivorship bias. That is to say, we look back fondly to, the poetry of Keats, Coleridge, the English Romantics. What we don't look at is the people who were the most popular at that time, the myriad other poets who were writing doggerel and were read by the average person more often or listened to by the average person. So we preserve the masterpieces and we tend to ignore all of the mediocre, the Philistinism, which was undoubtedly ubiquitous at the time. And I think that probably accounts for this pervasive sense of cultural decline that most people have in most generations.
I think, as I've said before on this podcast, there has been an unambiguous cultural decline in architecture,
Yes, yes.
and it's extremely evident when you look at pictures of prominent buildings, prize-winning buildings, town halls from different decades of the 20th century. There seems to have been a quite sudden shift from beautiful buildings to bland and ugly ones. But I don't think that has anything to do with dysgenics. It's
So, but
it's a cultural
it's
trend,
right.
a
And it's
lamentable one.
it's an interesting one because I think you have contempt for modernism in architecture. You dislike modernism. I would argue that modernism in literature, I think in painting, I would make this claim, and also in music, was like the last great cultural moment I would celebrate. So the modernist, Pound, Eliot, Marianne Moore, etc., Faulkner, Joyce, Virginia Woolf, I would celebrate that as this last moment of brilliant creativity before the decline of literature. Painting, I think you could make the same claim. I'm not as knowledgeable as you are about architecture, so I can't comment intelligently on that. But some of this is, as you say, it's just like a cultural fad or a intellectual understanding of art and aesthetics that is different now, I suppose. And some people would defend, like Frank Gehry, right?
Yeah.
For the postmodern
Yeah.
architect. I mean,
Yeah.
some people would, of course, laud his work. I imagine you find it rebarbative,
I'm
but
not a huge fan.
yeah, I'm intrigued by it, I would say. I don't know that I would celebrate it the way I would celebrate classicism, but
Yeah, I don't know anything about literature at all. I'm a total Philistine on that subject. But I would concede
you're
that
a
in
product of
film, excuse me?
dysgenic breeding. You're a product of dysgenic breeding.
Yeah, but film, which I know a little bit about,
Yeah.
there I would say modernism has produced some interesting works, some good works. It's architecture is where it has really
Yeah.
harmed the culture.
Well, to conclude this section, I suppose, films film's interesting because it illustrates like how important just like the medium is and how particular the medium is.
Mm.
Because I would argue that film probably, and most people would agree with this, had a couple of peaks, 40s, 70s, and then you might even argue now is like a film. I mean, I understand people caterwaul about the ubiquity of Marvel movies,
Yeah.
superhero movies. But on the other hand, there are many independent films that are just absolutely wonderful being produced made every year. So film, I would say, probably hit its apex, I would argue, in the 70s, whereas maybe literature, it's in the 1920s and 30s. Architecture, you would argue, maybe it's in Rome, ancient Rome.
I think Victorian architecture was still
Okay.
very splendid.
Okay. But yeah, so we both basically we think probably low-hanging fruit, not dysgenic, and cultural decline is difficult to discuss.
Yeah, I would also say that there's I'm very skeptical of the claim that there's been a decline in scientific and technological innovation. I think technology is
Hmm.
moving far too quickly, not
Yeah.
too slowly.
Yes.
And I think
Yeah.
any sensible conservative ought to have the same view. But in
W-
any case,
w-
I don't think dysgenics has uh, really had any detectable effect
Right.
on trends as broad as scientific innovation or culture.
Yeah, I agree.
But the next question is from Torin McCabe.